My name is Rachel, and in 2022 I died. For 2 full minutes, my heart stopped, and everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the world unraveled. I left this existence and saw something I wasn't supposed to see. America, burning like Rome in its final days. A blaze consuming it all, its cities, its symbols, its dreams. I saw who was behind it and why. And then, against all odds, I came back. Not for myself, but with a warning. For everyone. Before this, I wouldn't have been caught dead on a Christian channel. Irony, right? I wasn't religious. I barely believed in anything except the vague notion of energy or the universe. Faith was for other people, not me. But what I saw changed me. What I experienced shook me to the core of my being. Because the truth isn't just terrifying, it's urgent. There was a clock, enormous and impossible, frozen at 11:59. Stars rained from the sky, falling like fire. Then came the voice, so vast and thunderous it wasn't heard so much as felt. The hour has come. And through it all, a figure of brilliant, piercing light emerged. It didn't speak in words, but its message burned into me. The faithful will rise. You might think the world is solid, that time is endless, but it isn't. The foundation is crumbling, and I'm here to tell you why. It started with my heart giving out. You'd think the moment of death would be loud, violent, filled with drama. But it wasn't. It was quiet. Strangely so. First, there was this low hum in my ears, like the static of an old TV left on too long. The hospital lights overhead shimmered unnaturally, flickering like candles in the wind. And then the sounds of the voices, machines, the chaos of doctors shouting orders began to fade. Not completely, but like they were coming from some distant place I couldn't reach anymore. I could still see them, though. I watched them working over me, frantic and focused. They pounded on my chest, injected something into my arm, and called for more meds. But it felt like I wasn't really there anymore. I was drifting, hovering just out of reach, like I was trapped between two worlds. Then everything stopped. The noise, the lights, even the sensation of lying on the cold, hard gurney, it all just ceased to exist. 1 second, I was surrounded by the chaos of life, and the next, I was floating. Free, but completely untethered. I could see my body on the table below, pale and motionless. It was surreal, like staring at a mannequin that somehow still belonged to me. The doctors kept fighting, their faces set with grim determination. I tried to call out, to tell them, "Hey, I'm up here," but nothing came. No voice, no sound. And then I realized I wasn't in my body anymore. I wasn't even sure I had a body. I was just there, a presence, a consciousness, watching. And then came the pull. It started gently, like a tide rising around my feet, but it grew stronger, insistent. It wasn't painful or frightening, but it was absolute. Like an unseen hand had reached into my very soul and was drawing me away from everything I'd ever known. The room below began to dissolve, shrinking and dimming until it disappeared altogether. The doctors, the lights, the machines, it all faded into nothing. And then came the darkness. Thick, endless, alive. It wasn't empty, though. It felt like it was waiting for me, wrapping itself around me like a shroud. I wasn't afraid, not yet. I was curious, even strangely calm, but that calm didn't last. Because in the heart of that darkness, something was stirring. It wasn't just regular darkness, the kind you see when you close your eyes. No, this was something else entirely. It was thick, heavy, alive. It surrounded me, pressed against me like a living thing that had weight and purpose. And for the first time, I felt real fear. Where was I? What was happening? I couldn't see, couldn't hear. It was just me, suspended in this endless, suffocating void. Yet even in the middle of that nothingness, I could feel it. I was moving. Not walking, not flying, but being pulled deeper into the dark. There was no choice, no control. I wasn't calling the shots, and the realization hit me like a cold wave. I was powerless, completely at the mercy of whatever force was guiding me. The darkness wasn't passive. It wasn't just an absence of light. It felt dense, oppressive, like it had its own gravity. It pressed in on me from every direction, suffocating and relentless. There was no sound, no light, no sense of time or space. just me, alone in this immense, crushing emptiness. At first, I thought maybe I was dreaming. You know those vivid dreams where you're falling endlessly or trapped in some place you can't escape. It had that surreal quality, but this felt real. Too real. I tried to move, to reach out, to find something, anything, but there was nothing. No ground, no walls, no sense of up or down. Just endless, heavy blackness and me, floating in the middle of it. And then, out of nowhere, I heard whispers. At first I thought I was imagining them. They were so faint, barely more than the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. But they grew louder, closer, persistent. I couldn't ignore them. It wasn't like someone was speaking to me directly. It was more like waves of emotion crashing over me, grief, anger, regret. Feelings so overwhelming they took my breath away, if I even still had breath. Then came the shapes. At first they were just shadows. Faint, flickering at the edges of my vision, impossible to pin down. But the longer I looked, the clearer they became. Faces. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe more. Twisted, blurry faces like reflections in rippling water. They looked broken, sad, angry, lost. Each one seemed to carry an unbearable weight, and somehow I felt it too. One face moved closer, its eyes, if you could call them that, locking onto me. It didn't speak, not at first, but I could feel its presence, heavy and unrelenting. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo inside my own mind, it asked one word: why? Just that. One word. Not accusing, but not gentle either. It hit me like a blow to the chest, and I wanted to answer. I needed to answer. But I had no idea what it was asking, or why it felt so personal. Before I could figure it out, more voices joined in. A chorus of questions, overlapping, relentless. Why didn't you act? Why didn't you see? Their words were tangled, indistinct, but the emotions behind them were crystal clear. Guilt, anger, sorrow. It wasn't just like they were talking to me, it felt like they were talking through me, as though I was a conduit for all their pain and regret. And the worst part, I felt it too. The guilt, the weight of their sorrow. It wasn't mine, but somehow it was. Like I was responsible for something I couldn't name. The faces, the voices, the darkness, they all demanded answers I didn't have. And I began to wonder if I'd ever find them, or if I'd be trapped there forever. Even though I couldn't explain it, it felt like the faces were reaching into the very marrow of who I was, dragging out pieces of me that had been buried so deep, I didn't even know they existed. Memories, emotions, fragments of something raw and unspoken, all of it surfaced, sharp and unrelenting. The faces began to swirl, their forms twisting together until they became a massive, writhing shadow. It wasn't just alive, it was aware, and it was looking straight through me. The whispers turned into a cacophony of screams, shrill and endless, echoing from every direction, and yet somehow from inside me too. The sound clawed at my mind, relentless and suffocating. I tried to run, to move, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. I was pinned, trapped in this chaotic storm of sound and emotion. It felt like the entire weight of existence was bearing down on me, and I was seconds away from being crushed by it. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The faces vanished, swallowed whole by the darkness. The screams evaporated, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt almost alive. It wasn't a relief. The silence pressed in on me just as much as the chaos had, filling every corner of my mind until my own thoughts felt deafening. I stood or floated or existed. I didn't know anymore, alone in the void. But I wasn't alone. I felt it before I saw or didn't see it. A presence, vast and overwhelming. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, undeniable, and it was watching me. Not with malice, but with an intensity so profound it felt like it was peeling back every layer of my soul. It didn't need eyes. It didn't need words. It simply was, enormous and unyielding, like the weight of a storm cloud about to break. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It didn't feel like it wanted to harm me, but it didn't comfort me either. It was waiting, testing, judging. It was so massive, so all-encompassing, that it made me feel like I was nothing at all. And yet, it saw everything I was. The pressure of it made my chest ache, or whatever I had left of one. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And just when I thought I'd dissolve under its gaze, I saw it. A light. It was impossibly small, barely more than a flicker, like the tiniest spark struggling to hold its own against an endless black sea. But it was there, far in the distance, a single point of brilliance cutting through the void. It wasn't just a light, it was hope. Something in me shifted, stirred awake. I didn't understand it, but I felt it, deep and undeniable. The pull returned, stronger than ever. It gripped me, dragging me toward the light with a force I couldn't resist. I didn't want to resist. I wasn't sure if the presence behind me was letting me go or sending me forward, but I could still feel it, massive and immovable, watching. Not chasing me, just observing. As I moved closer, the light grew brighter, stronger. The darkness around me didn't just fade, it rippled, as if disturbed by the presence of the light. Waves of shadow bent and broke around me, and I started to see glimpses of something else. Colors, shapes. A world forming in pieces like fragments of a puzzle assembling themselves out of chaos. The pull intensified, and I couldn't stop moving even if I wanted to. And then the darkness was gone. I stood in a desert, but it wasn't like any desert I'd ever seen. The ground beneath me wasn't sand, it shimmered like crushed crystal, catching the light in dazzling, hypnotic patterns. It shifted with every step I took, unstable and glittering, as if it were alive. The air was thick, almost syrupy, clinging to me and making it hard to breathe. But the strangest thing of all was the sky. It wasn't just a sky, it was a living tapestry. Colors swirled in impossible patterns, folding into one another like molten glass. Shades I couldn't name streaked across the horizon, shifting and pulsing like a heartbeat. It felt alive, vast, and ancient, and for the first time, I realized just how small I was. This wasn't Earth. This wasn't a dream. This was somewhere far beyond anything I had ever known. I stood there, overwhelmed and unsteady, staring at a world that felt both alien and strangely familiar. Wherever I was, it was clear this wasn't the end. This was the beginning. The sky was alive with color, deep reds, fiery oranges, and rich purples all swirling together, like some cosmic storm frozen in place. Yet there wasn't a single gust of wind. Everything around me was unnervingly still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. That's when I saw them, the towers. They were colossal, rising far off in the distance like spires carved out of the earth itself. But these weren't ordinary buildings. Their surfaces twisted and writhed, almost as if they were alive. The walls pulsed and stretched, shimmering with an unsettling rhythm that felt too organic for stone or metal. Some of them leaned at impossible angles, defying gravity in a way that made my head spin, and at the top of each one there was a flag. At first, the flags seemed random, unfamiliar. But as I squinted through the shimmering air, I recognized some of them: the Union Jack, the French tricolor, others I couldn't immediately place. They fluttered slightly, though there was no wind to move them. Then my eyes were drawn to the tallest tower, the one that loomed over all the others, dominating the horizon. At its peak was the American flag. But something was wrong with it. It wasn't just hanging there, it was moving, twitching in a slow, rhythmic pulse. It rippled and stretched in a way that felt disturbingly alive. Watching it made my stomach twist, as if some deep, primal part of me was screaming to look away. I couldn't explain why, but just seeing it filled me with a sense of dread so profound it felt like the ground beneath me might give way. Before I even realized what I was doing, I started moving toward the towers. Or maybe I wasn't moving at all, maybe I was being pulled again. It was hard to tell. The desert beneath my feet began to change, trembling softly at first, then with more urgency. It wasn't like an earthquake. The shaking was deeper, resonating like the groaning of something ancient and enormous just beneath the surface. Then I heard it. A low, guttural rumble like thunder slowed to a crawl, heavy and all-encompassing. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the ground, the air, even through me. That's when I saw it a crack. It started small, a jagged line at the base of the American tower, but it spread fast, zigzagging upward like a bolt of black lightning. The rumble grew louder, deeper, more alive. Flames erupted from the crack, snaking up the sides of the tower, licking at its strange, pulsing surface. The whole structure groaned, an awful metallic screech that made me want to cover my ears. And then, in a moment I'll never forget, the tower collapsed not in a tumble or a crash, but in a slow, eerie disintegration. It crumbled into ash, dissolving into nothingness as if it had never truly existed. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where it had been, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. But before I could make sense of it, something else emerged. From the ashes, a massive black obelisk began to rise. It stretched upward, impossibly smooth and dark, its surface gleaming like polished glass. It towered even higher than the structure that had come before, piercing the swirling sky like a blade. Symbols began to appear on its surface, glowing faintly, intricate and alien. They were unlike anything I had ever seen, patterns that felt ancient and deeply wrong, like they carried a power not meant for human understanding. I couldn't read them, not in any literal sense, but I knew what they meant. The knowledge wasn't comforting. It felt invasive, like it had been placed in my mind without my consent. The air around me grew colder, heavier. A crushing pressure filled my chest, as if the obelisk itself was staring at me. Not with eyes, but with intent. It didn't need to speak to convey its power. Its presence alone was enough to make me feel like I was being stripped bare, exposed to something far greater than myself. And then I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it resonated through everything, the air, the ground, my very being. Deep and commanding, it echoed like the desert itself had found a voice. "The foundation is gone," it said. "The tower will rise." I froze. The words weren't just spoken. They felt heavy, like they carried a weight beyond anything I could comprehend. They weren't a mere statement. They were a declaration, final and irreversible. The ground beneath me trembled again, and I stood there, unable to move, staring at the towering obelisk. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew, with every part of me, that nothing would ever be the same. There was something final about it, something unstoppable. The obelisk pulsed with an eerie light, its glowing symbols now almost blinding. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to get as far away as I could, but my body betrayed me. My legs refused to move. The pull returned, stronger than ever, dragging me closer to the obelisk's impossible presence. Before I could reach it, the ground beneath me shifted. The shimmering desert began to change. The glittering, glass-like sand darkened, taking on an ashy hue, and the horizon began to blur. In the distance, flickering lights appeared, chaotic, scattered, and unmistakably fire. It wasn't random. It was a city, or what was left of one, burning against the backdrop of the shifting sky. The pull grew stronger, undeniable, and I knew, deep in my bones, that I was being taken there next. As I was dragged closer, the scene sharpened. The fires weren't distant anymore, they were everywhere, raging across what had once been a sprawling city. The desert gave way to cracked, blackened streets, the asphalt fractured and uneven. The skeletons of buildings loomed around me, their twisted frames barely holding on. Windows were shattered, their jagged remains catching the flickering light of the flames. Glass crunched beneath my feet, though I couldn't say for certain I was really walking. Smoke and ash filled the air, stinging my eyes and clinging to me like a second skin, even though I wasn't sure if I was truly breathing. At first, the city was unnervingly silent. The only sounds were the distant crackle of flames and the groaning of metal strained beyond its limits. It was as if the ruins themselves were holding their breath. But then I heard a scream. One sharp, panicked cry, slicing through the stillness like a knife. It came from deep within the rubble, desperate and raw. Before I could even process it, more screams followed, cascading over one another, growing louder and more frantic until the quiet was obliterated. The air became a symphony of terror, a deafening cacophony of fear and desperation. The pull dragged me deeper into the heart of the destruction, and that's when I saw them. People. Everywhere. They were running, scattering like ants fleeing a collapsing hill. Some clutched one another, their hands white-knuckled with panic, while others stumbled blindly, their faces masks of terror. A woman staggered past me, clutching a child in her arms, her face streaked with soot and tears. The child didn't cry, just stared blankly over her shoulder, as if they'd seen too much to process. Nearby, a man limped through the rubble, dragging someone behind him, an unconscious body, slack and heavy. His face was twisted with effort and pain, but he didn't stop. People streamed in every direction, trying to escape, though it was painfully clear there was nowhere to go. The fires were everywhere, roaring through the hollowed-out buildings like a living thing, consuming everything in their path. The ground beneath us trembled, threatening to give way at any moment, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and burning. The screams only grew louder, more desperate. The city wasn't just dying, it was unraveling, collapsing under some unbearable weight. And then I saw them. At first, I thought they were soldiers. They moved with a precision that screamed discipline, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. Their movements were too rigid, too calculated, like they were puppets on strings, driven by something unseen. When they stepped into the glow of the fires, my breath caught. These weren't men. Their faces, or the spaces where faces should have been, were hidden behind smooth, black masks. No eyes, no mouths, no features, just voids. It wasn't just how they looked, it was how they acted. Cold, efficient, merciless. They swept through the ruins like predators, pulling people from the rubble and tearing them out of their hiding spots. They weren't just gathering, they were hurting. Families were ripped apart as though their bonds meant nothing. A father, desperate and trembling with rage, lunged at one of them with a shard of broken wood, but the figure didn't react. It didn't even acknowledge the blow. Instead, it reached out, grabbed him by the throat, and lifted him effortlessly. The man's body dangled like a rag doll before being tossed aside, hitting the ground with a sound that made my stomach churn. He didn't move again. I stood there, frozen, unable to do anything but watch. But what haunted me wasn't the violence, it was the faces of the people. Not the masks, but the victims. Their eyes were empty, stripped of fight. They didn't scream. They didn't beg. They just let it happen, their expressions carved with a kind of hollow acceptance that chilled me more than the flames ever could. Then the sky began to change. The fiery reds and oranges that had twisted across the horizon deepened, bleeding into an unnatural blackness. The moon emerged, massive and impossibly close, hanging like a bloody wound in the sky. Its surface glowed an ominous red, casting jagged, fractured shadows across the wreckage. The moon didn't just illuminate the city, it transformed it, making every broken building and shard of glass look like part of a nightmare. And then the stars began to fall. They weren't distant streaks of light, delicate and fleeting. These were massive, blazing spheres, tearing through the sky like vengeful gods. They hit with devastating force, each impact erupting in a violent explosion that ripped the ground apart. Shock waves tore through the air, toppling whatever ruins still stood and hurling people off their feet. Fires erupted instantly wherever the stars struck, ravenous and unyielding. The heat was unbearable, suffocating, so real it felt like it was searing through me, even though I wasn't entirely sure I was there. One of the stars hit a nearby building. The explosion swallowed it whole, the blast hurling shards of concrete and steel like shrapnel. I was thrown backward, the force ripping through me like a tidal wave. There was no pain, only a strange, hollow emptiness, as if the world had been sucked out of me. When I opened my eyes, the building was gone. In its place was a smoking crater, the fires licking hungrily at the edges. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was another star, falling faster than the rest. But as it descended, I realized it wasn't light at all. It was an eagle. A massive eagle, its feathers charred and its wings bent unnaturally, spiraling downward in flames. It plummeted, powerless to fight its descent, and when it hit the ground, the impact was cataclysmic. The earth shook violently, the fires froze in place, and the screams that had filled the air were swallowed by a profound, deafening silence. In that moment, time seemed to stop. The world hung in stillness, and all I could see was the eagle's broken body smoldering in the dirt. It wasn't just a bird. It was something more, something vast and symbolic. The weight of it pressed into me, heavy and undeniable. Whatever the eagle had once stood for, it was gone now, brought low in a way that felt permanent. Final. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, and I knew deep down that this wasn't just an ending. It was a reckoning, a message that the world as I knew it was gone, and it wasn't coming back. I wanted to look away, to turn and run, but the pull wouldn't let me. It dragged me deeper into the chaos, closer to the heart of the nightmare. As I stumbled forward, I passed a group of people huddled together in the remains of what had once been a church. The walls were charred black, the roof collapsed in on itself, but still they stayed. Clutching each other, they prayed aloud, their voices trembling with desperation. One of the masked figures approached, moving with that same cold, mechanical precision. In its hands, it carried something, a torch, burning unnaturally bright in the smoky haze. Without a moment's hesitation, it hurled the torch into the group. Flames erupted instantly, roaring to life with a ferocity that seemed almost alive. The prayers turned to screams, raw and anguished, and I froze. I wanted to help, to stop it, to do anything, but my body betrayed me. My legs were like stone, rooted to the spot. All I could do was watch as the fire consumed them, as the masked figure turned and moved on without so much as a glance back, heading toward the next group. Above it all, the obelisk loomed, closer now. It towered over the city like some dark, all-seeing sentinel, its surface alive with those glowing, pulsing symbols. The symbols burned brighter with every passing moment, their rhythm eerily synchronized with the falling stars. The pull toward it grew stronger, dragging me closer and closer, and I knew whatever came next would be worse. The stars continued to fall. These weren't the kind of stars that inspired awe or hope. These were infernos, massive fireballs streaking across the blood-red sky with unnatural intensity. Each one slammed into the ground with a deafening explosion that tore the city apart block by block. The ground convulsed with every impact, shaking violently enough to rattle the air itself. I could feel the tremors deep in my chest, as if they were trying to pull me apart from the inside out. Everywhere the stars fell, devastation followed. Buildings crumbled like fragile sandcastles, their steel frames folding under the force. Streets split open into jagged, yawning chasms that seemed to stretch endlessly into the earth. Flames erupted, but these weren't ordinary fires. It was as if the air itself had caught fire, blazing with an intensity that seemed to consume more than just the physical. The heat felt like it was peeling away layers of something deeper, something essential, even though I wasn't really there in any conventional sense. And the stars, God, the stars, they weren't just fire and heat. As they streaked across the sky, I began to see shapes within them. Faces, twisted, distorted faces that seemed to writhe and scream, though no sound escaped them. They weren't human, not really. Their features were too warped, too wrong, too sharp in some places, too blurred in others, like someone had tried to sculpt them out of fractured memories. Their eyes were hollow yet piercing, staring out at the city with a hunger that made my stomach churn. They weren't random. They weren't just falling. They were here for something. And as the pull dragged me closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they were here for, it wasn't going to stop with the city. They were watching, waiting, and I was being dragged straight into the heart of their gaze. One of the stars smashed into a tower not far from me, the force of the explosion shattering the night. The blast tore through the structure, hurling debris in all directions, twisted metal, jagged glass, fragments of stone. I instinctively raised my arms to shield myself, but the shards passed through me like smoke through the air. Even so, the shockwave hit me like a freight train, knocking me backward. I landed hard on the fractured asphalt, the impact hollowing me out in a way that wasn't physical. It was as if the destruction itself was carving pieces out of me, leaving me emptier with every second. The ground beneath me groaned, trembling with a violence that felt alive. Then came the sound, deep, guttural, and primal. It wasn't just noise. It was something ancient, something vast, rising from the earth's core. A jagged crack split open the ground in front of me, glowing with a molten red light that seeped into the air like blood from a wound. The roar that came from its depths wasn't just heard, it was felt, a vibration that gripped my chest and made it hard to breathe. Whatever was below, it wasn't just waking. It was alive, and it was angry. Above it all, the obelisk loomed, dominating the skyline. The strange symbols etched into its surface flared with light, pulsing in a rhythm that matched the chaos around it. Faster and faster they pulsed, feeding off the destruction like a parasite growing stronger. The pull toward it was inescapable now, dragging me forward even as the world shattered around me. I stumbled past another group of people. They were gathered in the open, their faces pale and streaked with tears. Some held hands, others prayed, their voices trembling with desperation. They clung to each other like the last remnants of humanity in a world that had no place for them anymore. It didn't matter. A star plummeted from the sky, landing directly in their midst. The explosion swallowed them whole, leaving nothing behind, no bodies, no ashes, just a charred crater and the faintest whiff of burnt air. My feet moved without my permission, each step dragging me closer to the obelisk. The pull was relentless, as if the tower's very existence demanded my presence. Overhead, the stars continued to fall, blazing trails of fire across the blood-soaked sky. But now I noticed something different. Their descent wasn't random. Each one struck with unerring precision, wiping out what little remained of the city. Buildings crumbled like paper, streets split into jagged chasms, and fires erupted in waves that consumed everything in their path. It was destruction with purpose, orchestrated chaos, as if the stars themselves were weapons aimed by an unseen hand. And then I saw it. At the edge of my vision, a flicker of motion caught my eye. It wasn't a star, and it wasn't a person. It was the eagle, the same one I'd seen falling earlier, its wings engulfed in flames. But this time it wasn't plummeting. It was flying or trying to. Its charred feathers were ragged and torn, its movements strained, but it fought against gravity with every ounce of its being. Its wings beat unevenly, the effort etched into every motion. For a fleeting moment, I dared to believe. I thought it might rise, might escape this nightmare. But just as it reached for the heavens, a star streaked across the sky and struck it square in the chest. The explosion was blinding, an eruption of fire and light that obliterated everything in its path. The eagle vanished in an instant, swallowed by the blast. The force of the explosion rippled outward, a shockwave so powerful it knocked me off my feet again. I hit the ground hard, but there was no pain, just a strange, suffocating numbness. My ears rang with silence, and for a moment the entire world felt suspended. No sound, no motion, just the emptiness where the eagle had been. It wasn't just a bird. It had meant something enormous, something essential. And now it was gone, snuffed out in a single, violent moment. Whatever it symbolized, whatever it had been fighting for, was over. And as I lay there, staring at the empty sky, I realized the fall of the eagle wasn't just an ending. It was a verdict. Final, absolute. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left. Just a scattering of embers drifting lazily through the air, glowing faintly as they fell like snow. The eagle was gone, erased entirely, and the emptiness it left behind was overwhelming. Above me, the stars seemed to pause, suspended in the blood-red sky like embers themselves, glowing but still. The silence that followed was suffocating, a silence so deep it felt as though the entire world was holding its breath. Then I saw it. The obelisk stood in the distance, blazing with an intensity that was almost unbearable to look at. Its symbols, those strange, otherworldly markings, pulsed in perfect rhythm with the faint tremors beneath my feet. It wasn't just standing, it was alive, feeding off the destruction that surrounded it. Its glow wasn't just light, it was power, raw and consuming. And then the voice came again. It was deep, resonant, and inescapable, echoing through the ruins like rolling thunder. The hour has come. The tower will rise. The words sent a cold shiver racing down my spine, even as the fires around me blazed with unbearable heat. The pull toward the obelisk grew stronger, dragging me forward as if it had claimed not just my body, but something deeper, something essential. I wanted to stop, to plant my feet, to fight against whatever force was pulling me, but I couldn't. It was like trying to resist gravity itself. The obelisk was calling me closer, and I knew with every step that whatever was waiting for me, there was nothing I wanted to face. The stars began to fall again, streaking across the sky like fiery arrows. Each impact brought fresh waves of destruction, more flames, more chaos. The air was so thick with smoke, I felt like I was suffocating, even though I wasn't sure if I was truly breathing. The heat pressed in from all sides, searing and oppressive, as if it wasn't just the fires, but the very atmosphere that was burning. The city was nearly gone now, reduced to rubble and ash, the skeletal remains of what had once been a place full of life. And with each step closer to the obelisk, an overwhelming sense of doom settled deeper in my chest. And then everything stopped. The fires froze mid-flicker, their flames motionless and silent, as though someone had pressed pause on reality. The stars, which had been falling relentlessly, hung frozen in the sky, glowing faintly but still. Even the screams, the endless, horrible screams that had been everywhere, fell silent, leaving behind an eerie, unnatural stillness. It was as though the world itself had drawn a sharp breath and was holding it, waiting. The only sound was the faint hum of the obelisk. Its glowing symbols pulsed steadily, like the beating of a heart, filling the silence with a low, almost hypnotic rhythm. My gaze was locked on it, its presence overpowering and magnetic, and that's when I saw it. The light. At first, it was barely a pinprick on the horizon, faint and almost insignificant against the chaos. But it grew quickly, spreading out over the ruins like the first rays of a sunrise. This wasn't like the harsh, clinical light of the stars or the obelisk's glow. This light was different. Warm, golden, alive. It moved with a purpose, washing over the destruction and softening it, making the jagged edges of the rubble and the blackened ash seem almost peaceful. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt something I thought was impossible, a spark of hope. The light grew brighter, and as it did, it began to take shape. At first, it was nothing more than a vague outline, an amorphous presence that defied definition. But as it drew closer, it became clear. It was a figure. Tall and commanding, they were wrapped in robes that shimmered like liquid gold, shifting and rippling as though made from light itself. Their face was hidden, obscured by the brilliance of the glow, but their presence was undeniable. They didn't speak, not at first, but I could feel their gaze on me. It wasn't the cold, piercing stare of the obelisk or the hollow, faceless figures I had seen before. This was something else, intense, but not harsh, powerful, but not cruel. Even though I couldn't see their eyes, I knew they were looking directly at me, seeing through every layer of who I was. And for the first time, I felt like the nightmare had paused, not ended, but paused. The silence around us was heavy, waiting for something, and I knew whatever came next would change everything. It wasn't just a gaze, it was a knowing. They weren't simply looking at me, they were seeing me. Every thought, every fear I'd buried, every failure I'd tried to forget, it was all laid bare under their golden light. When they finally spoke, their voice wasn't loud, but it reverberated inside me, resonating in a way that was impossible to ignore. "What begins in fire ends in fire," they said, their words heavy with purpose. "But from the ashes, the faithful will rise." Their voice wasn't just sound. It was truth, a declaration that settled in my chest with an unshakable weight. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a warning. It was both, and it felt as though the universe itself was listening. As they spoke, the light around them flared brighter, pouring over the ruins and pressing back the endless darkness. The fires that had frozen mid-burn began to shift, but they didn't rage as they had before. Instead, they transformed. The flames turned golden, swirling into patterns so intricate and deliberate they felt alive. Watching them was overwhelming. It was beauty beyond words, the kind that ached to behold. Tears pricked at my eyes, unbidden, as the destruction around me seemed, for a moment, to become something sacred. But the obelisk didn't move. Its dark surface seemed to drink in the golden light, refusing to yield. The glowing symbols etched into its skin pulsed faster, feeding off the chaos as if defying the figure's presence. I could feel it, the obelisk's power growing, its resistance coiling like a spring ready to snap. The air thickened, colder and heavier, as the pull toward it intensified, dragging me closer to its ominous shadow. Then the figure raised their hand. A golden scepter appeared in their grasp, shimmering with the same light that surrounded them. They pointed it toward the obelisk, and for a moment the world stood still. The tension in the air became unbearable, a suffocating pressure that seemed to press down on everything. The symbols on the obelisk flared violently, their glow searing into my vision like a brand. It felt as though two colossal forces were locked in a silent, invisible struggle, the weight of their clash rippling through the broken city like an unseen quake. Then the figure lowered the scepter and turned to me. The brilliance of their light dimmed slightly, and their voice carried a new urgency. "Watch and remember," they said. "What is written will come to pass. The foundation has fallen, but the faithful will endure." Their words echoed in my mind, etching themselves into my very being. I could feel their meaning sinking into me, undeniable and eternal. The pull of the obelisk surged again, stronger and more demanding than before. The figures stepped back, their golden light receding into the distance. It didn't fade, it lingered, glowing faintly on the horizon like a distant sunrise. And then they were gone. The fires roared back to life. The stars, once paused, resumed their relentless descent, hurtling toward the earth with devastating precision. The chaos returned with a vengeance, rushing in like a tidal wave. The heat, the smoke, the destruction, all of it swallowed me whole once more. But I wasn't the same. Something inside me had changed. The figure's words and light had left a mark deeper than the pull of the obelisk or the destruction around me. I wasn't sure if it was strength or clarity, but I knew one thing. I could no longer look at the chaos without understanding its meaning, and I could no longer look at myself without knowing I had a role to play in what came next. The fires roared around me, their heat searing through the smoky air, but I didn't flinch. The stars kept falling, streaking across the sky like vengeful spirits, each one leaving fresh devastation in its wake. And yet, even as the chaos pressed in, I felt steadier, sharper. The figure's words still echoed in my mind. "Watch and remember. What is written will come to pass." The pull of the obelisk grew stronger, a relentless force dragging me forward step by step. I didn't fight it anymore, I couldn't. It wasn't just my body being drawn to the tower. It felt like it was pulling at my soul, threading itself into the core of who I was. Each step felt heavier than the last, but I kept moving, my eyes locked on the towering monolith. As I drew closer, I realized the obelisk was far larger than I had imagined. It stretched so high that its tip seemed to pierce the sky itself, and its surface, dark and smooth as obsidian, shimmered with the light of its strange, pulsing symbols. The hum it emitted grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, vast and consuming. And then the tremors started again. The ground beneath me buckled and cracked, splitting apart with jagged lines that glowed red-hot, as if the earth itself was breaking open. The air grew heavier, colder, and I felt that ancient, vast presence rising again from deep within the fissures. A low, guttural roar reverberated through the ruins, shaking the remains of the city to its core. Ahead of me, the obelisk flared. Its symbols burned with an intensity I could barely look at, their patterns shifting and reshaping faster than I could comprehend. The pull became almost unbearable now, dragging me toward the base of the tower, where the ground seemed to melt and reform in strange, impossible ways. And then I saw them. Figures, hundreds of them, emerged from the shadows around the obelisk. They weren't like the masked ones I had seen before. These were different. They were tall and skeletal, their skin pale and stretched tight over their frames. Their eyes were empty voids, yet somehow they saw everything. They moved in unison, each step deliberate, their gaunt faces tilted toward the obelisk like it was the only thing that mattered. They didn't look at me, not at first. But as I stepped closer, their heads began to turn, one by one. They didn't speak, but their silence was louder than any scream. I could feel their gaze piercing through me, stripping me bare. They weren't human, not entirely. Whatever they had once been, that part of them was gone. Now they were something else, something bound to the obelisk. And then one of them stepped forward. Unlike the others, this one moved with authority, its presence heavier, more oppressive. Its eyes, or the voids where eyes should have been, locked onto me. It raised a hand, and a dark, crackling energy gathered in its palm. "You are not of this place," it said, its voice a dry whisper that cut through the roaring fires and distant screams. "And yet you are chosen." The energy in its hand flared, swirling like smoke and flame, and it pointed toward me. The pull of the obelisk surged again, dragging me forward until I was nearly at its base. The skeletal figure watched me intently, as if waiting for something, some reaction, some answer. I wanted to speak, but no words came. I could only stare up at the obelisk, its symbols blazing brighter with every second, and feel the weight of everything that had brought me here. The figure lowered its hand, tilting its head slightly, almost curiously. "Step forward," it commanded, its voice laced with something I couldn't quite name. "You stand on the edge of what is written. Choose." The obelisk pulsed, its hum growing louder, drowning out the world around me. The skeletal figures stood motionless, their dark gazes fixed on me, and the stars continued to fall, blazing trails across the burning sky. The choice wasn't clear, but I knew it was mine to make, and whatever I did next would change everything. The figures' presence had changed something in me. Their words, their light, it had planted a seed of hope. It was fragile, barely holding on in the chaos, but it was enough. Enough to keep me moving, even as the nightmare unfolded around me. The obelisk loomed larger with every step, its pull stronger, more insistent. Whatever awaited me there, I knew it would be the final chapter. Each step closer felt heavier, like the air itself was trying to drag me back, thick with smoke and heat and something unnameable. The ground beneath me trembled with every quake, spidering cracks spreading out in all directions. Fires raged on either side, their roar almost drowning out the relentless hum of the obelisk. The stars kept falling, relentless, blazing trails of destruction through the sky. The world around me wasn't just ending, it was unraveling, piece by piece. Then, without warning, the ground ahead of me split wide open. The crack was enormous, a jagged wound in the earth so deep that a fiery red light poured out from its core. At first, I thought it was just another chasm like the ones I'd seen before, but then something began to rise from it, something impossibly large. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as a massive clock emerged from the depths. It was ancient, hovering just above the ground, its surface glowing faintly in the dim light. The edges were cracked and worn, its frame tarnished as though it had been buried for centuries. Its glass face was smudged and fractured, but I could still make out the numbers etched into it. The clock wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. It was alive. The hands of the clock weren't moving in any way that made sense. They jerked and twitched, lurching forward only to snap back again, as if they couldn't decide which direction to go. The ticking sound was slow at first, uneven and strained, but it began to grow louder, more deliberate. The sound pressed into my chest, deep and resonant, until it felt like the entire world was pulsing in time with it. I couldn't look away. The clock wasn't just a clock. It was a mirror, a window, something more. The longer I stared, the more I saw. Images flickered across its glass face, faint at first but growing clearer. Fires, collapsed buildings, people running, screaming, crying. Scenes I'd already witnessed and others I hadn't. It was like the clock was showing everything, not just this moment, but all moments, compressed into its cracked, glowing surface. Time itself was trapped inside it, and I was staring into its soul. The hands of the clock began to spin faster, wildly, the jerking motions giving way to a frenzied whirl. The ticking turned frantic, each sound a hammer striking the air, louder and faster. It wasn't just counting, it was counting down. My chest tightened, and I felt a scream building in my throat. I wanted to yell, "Stop it, just stop," but I couldn't. The pull of the obelisk dragged me closer, step by step, as if it wanted me to witness what came next. The images on the clock's face blurred together, the chaos of fire and destruction twisting into something unrecognizable, something I couldn't name but felt in the pit of my stomach. And then, as suddenly as it began, the clock stopped. The hands froze in place. The frantic ticking cut off, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to smother the entire world. The hands were stuck at 11:59. I didn't need anyone to tell me what it meant. I felt it in my bones, in the marrow of who I was. This wasn't just time stopping. It was something far greater. An ending. A moment suspended on the edge of the irreversible. The pull of the obelisk surged again, more forceful than ever, dragging me forward toward the clock and the towering monolith behind it. My heart, or whatever was left of it, pounded as I realized I was being drawn into the very heart of what this all meant. And somehow I knew 11:59 wasn't the end. This was it. Whatever the clock represented, time had run out. A single droplet of water appeared on its cracked glass surface, trembling like it was alive. It clung there for a heartbeat, quivering with tension, and then it fell. The droplet struck the glass with a sharp, crystalline chime that rang out like a bell tolling in the distance. The sound spread outward, cascading through the air, and as it did, fissures began to spiderweb across the clock's face. They glowed faintly, pulsing with an eerie golden light, like veins of fire breaking through frozen glass. And then the hand shattered. The shards didn't just fall, they exploded outward in every direction, each fragment catching the golden light before disappearing into the fiery chasm below. The clock groaned, deep and guttural, a sound that was disturbingly alive. It wasn't just breaking, it was dying. Then the voice came. "The hour has come. The reckoning begins." It wasn't the voice I'd heard before. This one was cold, sharp as broken glass, and its words sliced through the air with a brutal finality. It echoed everywhere through the ground, through the trembling sky, and inside my chest, vibrating like the resonance of a struck bell. The obelisk flared to life. Its symbols ignited, their light so blinding I had to shield my eyes. The pull toward it grew unbearable, as if the air itself had turned into chains dragging me forward. My body felt like it was being torn apart, not physically but something deeper, something I couldn't name. Above me, the sky began to collapse. The stars, which had paused for that brief, terrible moment, began to fall again. But this time, they fell faster, harder, each one crashing into the earth with an explosion that shook the world to its core. The craters they left behind weren't just scars, they were voids, chasms so deep they seemed to devour the earth itself. The fires roared higher, their heat consuming everything, and the cracks in the ground spread wider, splitting the city into pieces. The destruction was complete, and yet it wasn't chaotic. It felt deliberate, methodical, like every explosion, every fracture was part of some vast, incomprehensible design. The voice spoke again, louder this time, resonating like the final note of a dirge. "The foundation is gone. The tower will rise." I turned toward the obelisk, and it seemed larger than ever, its dark, smooth surface stretching endlessly into the sky. Its glowing symbols pulsed in perfect rhythm with the trembling earth, a heartbeat that felt more alive than anything left in the ruins. The pull grew stronger still, an irresistible force dragging me closer. The air around the obelisk buzzed with energy, crackling like a storm about to break. It wasn't just pulling me, it was claiming me. I wanted to run, to turn away, but there was nowhere to go. The obelisk wasn't simply calling me. It was demanding me. Then my gaze fell back to the clock. It lay shattered and broken, its hands frozen forever at 11:59. The jagged edges of its face glimmered faintly in the firelight, and the image burned itself into my mind, as if etched there by the weight of its meaning. This wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration. Time hadn't been running out. Time had already run out. The pull became a surge, a tidal force dragging me faster toward the obelisk. The fires screamed louder, their flames climbing higher into the collapsing sky. The stars kept falling, each one striking with precision, carving away what little remained of the city until there was almost nothing left. The voice echoed again, reverberating through every crack and fissure in the earth, every ember in the air, every pulse of the obelisk's light. It was inescapable, a command not just to me, but to the world itself. The hour has come. The reckoning begins. And as I was pulled closer, swallowed by the shadow of the obelisk, I felt it. The end, the beginning, and something else, a truth I couldn't yet grasp, but that I knew would change everything. One last time, the faithful will rise. And then I was gone. The light from the obelisk flared brighter, consuming everything, the fires, the stars, the ruins, even the sound. It all disappeared in an instant, swallowed by a blinding, all-encompassing white void. I was weightless, floating in the vast emptiness, untethered and completely disconnected. Everything I thought I was, my fears, my memories, my very sense of self, felt laid bare in that endless light. There was no hiding here, not from the light, not from myself. And then I felt it. A presence, not the cold, detached voice of the obelisk, but something warmer, deeper. It didn't speak in words, but its meaning wrapped around me like a familiar embrace, reaching into every part of me. "You are not abandoned," it said. Though the words weren't spoken, they were felt. That's when I understood. The light wasn't just light. It was love. Pure, overwhelming love. The kind that makes you feel impossibly small and yet deeply, completely known. It saw everything, the best and the worst of me, and held it without judgment. I wanted to stay there forever, to let that love seep into every corner of me, erasing the pain, the fear, the doubt. For the first time, I felt whole. But even as I longed to remain, I felt something pulling me back. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't rejection. It was purpose. I wasn't done yet. There was still more for me to do, and the light knew it, even if I didn't. The warmth began to fade, replaced by something colder, heavier. Slowly, sound returned, a faint, rhythmic beeping, steady and mechanical. It felt familiar, like the echo of a half-remembered dream. Then the crushing weight in my chest hit me, a burning, desperate sensation, as though my lungs were clawing for air. I gasped, and my eyes snapped open. I was back. The was chaos. Bright, fluorescent lights stabbed at my eyes. Machines beeped frantically all around me, their tones urgent and sharp. Doctors and nurses moved in a blur, shouting to each other, their voices distant and muffled, like I was underwater. "She's back," someone said. But I could barely process it. My body felt heavy, foreign, like I was a guest in my own skin. I blinked up at the ceiling, disoriented and overwhelmed, trying to make sense of where I was. Everything I'd seen, everything I'd felt, was still with me, clearer than any dream, etched into me as though it had been carved into my soul. And it wasn't fading. In the days that followed, I tried to piece it all together. The obelisk, the clock, the falling stars, the figure of light. None of it felt random. None of it felt like just a vision. It was a message. A warning. Not just for me, but for all of us. The obelisk was darkness, plain and simple. It was the foundation of something vast and terrible, something that would rise and consume unless it was stopped. The clock was unmistakable in its meaning. Time hadn't been running out. Time was gone. But it was the figure of light, their words, that echoed loudest in my mind. "What begins in fire ends in fire, but from the ashes the faithful will rise." At first, I didn't understand. Faithful to what? But as I replayed every detail, every moment, clarity began to bloom. This wasn't just about survival. It was about standing firm in the truth. The faithful wouldn't rise because they were spared. They would rise because they endured, because they held on to something greater, even as the world around them burned. And I knew then that I'd been given a choice. Not just to survive, but to stand, to believe, to act, to prepare. Because the hour wasn't coming. It was already here, in His truth. The chaos I'd seen, the destruction, the despair, it wasn't random. It was the inevitable outcome of a world that had turned away from God, a world that had chosen its own fleeting desires over the eternal. And yet, even in the deepest darkness, there was hope. Not hope in governments or towers or human hands, hope in Him. The vision wasn't just a warning, it was a call to repentance, a call to faith, a call to readiness. The figure of light wasn't some vague spiritual presence. It was Him, Christ, the light of the world, standing unshaken against the rising tide of darkness. His words were unwavering. There would be fire, there would be destruction, but there would also be redemption. Redemption for those who remained faithful, for those who clung to Him in a world that had long forgotten its Creator. When I left the hospital, the world outside felt heavier, like it was teetering on the edge of something colossal and unseen. People rushed past, their lives filled with work, laughter, arguments, distractions, completely unaware of the weight that hung over them. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab them by the shoulders and tell them what I'd seen, what I knew was coming. But how do you explain something like this? How do you make people understand without sounding like you've lost your mind? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. The message wasn't about making people believe me. It wasn't about convincing them of my vision. It was about pointing them to Him. About reminding all of us that this life is temporary. That everything we build here, our cities, our monuments, our dreams will crumble in the end. The only foundation that lasts is Christ. That clock, frozen at 11:59, burned itself into my mind. Time had run out, but grace hadn't. Not yet. The vision wasn't just about fire and destruction. It was about the chance to rise from the ashes. The faithful wouldn't rise because they were strong or perfect or deserving. They would rise because they were His, because they trusted in Him, even when the world fell apart, even when everything else seemed lost. I don't know why I was chosen to see this. I don't know what's coming next or how much time we have left. But I know this: the foundation is gone. The hour has passed. The reckoning is near. But for those who cling to the truth, for those who cling to Him, there is hope. There's always hope. Every night since, I've looked up at the sky, half expecting to see the stars begin to fall. So far, they haven't. Not yet. But I know it's only a matter of time. And when it happens, I'll remember what I saw. I'll remember the light, the promise, and the call to stand firm. Because what begins in fire doesn't end in despair. It ends in redemption. In Him.